The lights are on, but the city is dying. An insomnia plague is sweeping through the streets, and the authorities have abandoned their people to die in silence. Forced into isolation, the survivors have had enough. Fury is erupting, the barricades are falling, and the fight for life is about to get bloody.
What happens when a city that can't sleep finally snaps?
Welcome back to the latest 2026 disaster film, Wake TV series. The interim Prime Minister Christopher has just finished announcing the situation regarding the Insomnia Virus. That same night, Christopher received a call from the chief virologist. The laboratory has made new progress in the research of the Insomnia Virus. They discovered that the most typical symptom for the infected is bloodshot eyes. This is actually a typical symptom of intracranial hemorrhaging. About 10 days after the red streaks first appear, they form a closed loop on the eyeball. That is the moment when death arrives for the infected. Christopher stood frozen in place, speechless for a long moment, because the blood streaks in his own eyes had already filled more than half a circle. But that wasn't even the worst of it. Early the next morning, countless citizens took to the streets in protest. They didn't know where the information had leaked from, but it turns out this horrific virus is actually linked to the new Prime Minister. Naturally, the enraged public identified him as the primary culprit. However, Christopher didn't have the energy to explain anything. This is because the largest order in the history of the pharmaceutical company was personally pushed by Christopher during his tenure as health minister. In a cabinet meeting, he announced the latest findings from the virologists. Once an infected person's eyes begin to turn bloodshot, they have at most only about 10 days left to live. Christopher admitted frankly that his own time was running out. He felt it was his duty to release the news to the public, so that the infected may cherish what little time they have left. But to his surprise, his girlfriend was the first to stand against it, believing it would only trigger even greater social unrest. But Christopher's mind was made up. He refused to lie to those on the brink of death. And so that very afternoon, in his capacity as acting prime minister, Christopher formally addressed the public's speculations regarding the virus. He also clarified the exact timeline for the infected, from the initial incubation period to the point of death. As the press conference drew to a close, with heavy solemnity, Christopher offered a formal apology to the people. Regarding the leak of this virus, he confessed that he bore the ultimate responsibility, one he could not escape, and announced his immediate resignation from the office of Prime Minister. The moment the press conference concluded, the cabinet members held an emergency meeting. The others were either infected or unable to leave due to family members being infected. The rest were either infected themselves or tied down, caring for family members who were. By regulation, the position should have been filled by the longest-serving minister, but considering that the current situation required international support, the group was left with no choice but to nominate Christopher's girlfriend, namely the foreign minister Saga, to take office as the acting prime minister. Saga considered the proposal for a long time. She finally accepted the poison chalice. However, she put forward one additional condition, and that was that she must also concurrently serve as the Minister of Defense. Because the public's emotions had reached a fever pitch, social order was teetering on the edge of collapse. Iron-fisted measures were the only way to suppress the unrest. And so on the second day of Saga's term, Sweden ushered in its strictest lockdown in history, effective both day and night. Because no one was willing to sit at home and wait for death, countless citizens pushed back hard against the police riot shields. Defying death, the masses took to the streets in protest. Meanwhile, with the help of shadowy accomplices, the extremist Wilson had secretly constructed a sophisticated explosive. He intended to deal a crushing blow to the authorities at the most critical moment. As the entire nation stood on the brink of total chaos, the nation burned. Former Prime Minister Chris ignored all warnings, hell-bent on making his escape from the capital. Because his only son was serving a sentence in a prison on the outskirts of the city, he had to bring him back before the impending chaos consumed everything. It sounds somewhat absurd when put into words. Chris had always had a strained relationship with his son. The father and son treated each other almost like ghosts. In a way, one could even call it family harmony. That day, to his horror, Chris discovered that his son had been secretly stashing prohibited substances, believing that a short-term sharp pain is better than a long-term dull ache. Placing duty above blood, Chris reported his own son and personally sent him to prison. His horror, Chris realized the penitentiary was no controlled facility. It was a lawless purgatory where only the most brutal survived. The inmates would start a brawl at the slightest provocation. For them, a day without a fight was a day wasted. For several days, Chris had been receiving frantic calls from Hugo, who screamed that someone in the prison was trying to kill him. Because the public blamed his father for creating this viral apocalypse, Chris dismissed Hugo's pleas as a mere excuse to escape prison. After all, there were guards inside. It couldn't possibly be as dire as his son claimed. But that very night, the nightmare became real. A gang of inmates stormed into Hugo's cell, and the son of the man who ruled the country was brutally beaten to a pulp. Early the next morning, Hugo woke up to total anarchy as a full-scale war erupted between the prisoners and the guards. Hugo spotted the giant who had taught him a lesson the night before. Cowering in the shadows, he was too terrified to move. But what happened next was something he never saw coming. That cautious decision, by sheer luck, ended up saving his life. Deep down, Chris had always been haunted by guilt. The moment he stepped down as prime minister, his only mission was to bring his son home. But the city was already a fortress. The roads were deadlocked, and without an official government pass, there was no way out. Chris tried to pull rank, hoping his status would open the gates, but the guard was unmoved by ghosts of past power. In a flash of desperation, he chose force over diplomacy, gunning the engine and smashing through the outpost. Perhaps out of a lingering respect for his former status, the soldiers fired only a few symbolic shots into the air, hesitating to take down the man who once led them. They watched in silence as he sped away, leaving the checkpoint far behind in a cloud of dust.